Welcome, folks. See people coming in slowly here. We're going to give just a couple of minutes before we get started. So just a few minutes of hang around and let folks trickle in. Um, Dan and I were chatting just on some of the nerdy stuff around donor advised funds and charitable giving. I have just like a random question for you, Dan, while we're sort of waiting for folks to come in. Do you have a
Yeah.
position on for nonprofit organizations, executive compensation, attracting talent at the highest level for running those organizations? And I think that there's a fair amount of differing opinions around that. Do you have any sort of stance on that?
I do. That is a good question, and that is a question that there are a lot of very, very strong opinions.
Okay. Maybe I didn't
I
tee up a ball there. Sorry,
Yeah,
Dan.
no. I mean, my personal opinion is charities are having to compete against for-profit companies for attention, for market share, for wallet share. And if we are serious about solving social and environmental problems, which, charities and nonprofits are, we should allow them to compete just as aggressively as any for-profit, which includes executive compensation. So a lot of people generally push back on high executive pay in charities, but if you want to attract the smartest, brightest, high potential performers, I think you need to be able to have that as a tool to attract those people. So I'm in the camp of um, we should not treat nonprofits differently than we treat for-profits from a compensation standpoint.
Cool. Yeah, I think I agree with you. Again, sorry for the tough question as an icebreaker that folks come in, but that one's always on my mind. I wonder. My wife works for a nonprofit, and I think they do pretty well in terms of executive comp, San Diego Humane Society. But yeah, I know it's sort of a hot button, and I think folks screen for that executive comp level or
Mhm.
just how much they're compensating their employees, what's direct impact of funds.
Yep.
Uh,
There's a documentary you should check out. It's called Uncharitable.
okay.
It came out, I don't know, within the last 12 to 18 months, but it's about that exact topic and kind of the history of why it's evolved the way that it has and kind of the damage that it's doing to the nonprofit sector.
Awesome. Thanks for that recommendation. I'll check that out. Okay, I am going to go ahead and kick us off here. Thanks for joining us, everyone. This is one of our series, it's a webinar in our series that we're calling Solution Spotlight. And this is an opportunity for us to bring in external experts. We do a lot of content where members are presenting or members of the XYPN team are presenting, but we recognize that there is just a ton of knowledge and subject matter expertise outside of membership and the XYPN team. And so we want to bring in experts in different areas to share, to educate, to talk about different opportunities for both our members and friends of the network. So this is open to anyone. It's not a member-only event. Today's Solution Spotlight is called What is a Donor Advised Fund? The Benefits of Incorporating DAFs into Your Investment Advice. And I'm just going to, before I introduce Dan, I'm just going to hit a few housekeeping items today. As you have questions during the webinar, please use the Q&A option. It should be in the menu bar of your Zoom app, whether you're in the browser or using the app. Drop your questions in there. Chances are we'll save most of those to the end if there's something that's especially sort of topic specific that we want to address as we're going through. We might jump in, but generally drop those in there as they come up, and then we'll hit them at the end. I want to let you know about a couple other events and things that XYPN is providing to membership right now, as well as non-members. On November 12th, we'll be hosting another of these Solution Spotlight webinars with the budgeting and cash flow technology Monarch Money. That will be co-presented with a special guest, Natalie Taylor. She's an XYPN member. She's a well-known both member, advocate of Monarch Money, and has a tech background as well. That's going to be called Gain the Competitive Edge, Real-Time Client Spending Insights for Advisors with Monarch Money. That will be, again, November 12th I'll drop the link in the chat here so you can find that. Um, and then I also want to let you know that even though we are just coming off of our conference, XYPN Live, last month in Minneapolis, tickets are on sale for next year. We've announced the dates and location. That will be September 25th to the 27th next year in Austin, Texas. You can get tickets on sale, $4.99 for XYPN members, $6.99 for non-members. That early bird pricing is only available through the end of the year. And I will drop the link to that in the chat as well. With that, I want to introduce Dan, our guest speaker. So Dan Blake is the CEO and founder of UI Charitable Advisors, which is a leading philanthropic planning and advisory firm. The team at UI Charitable partners with financial advisors to offer clients financial tools that align portfolio objectives with their philanthropic goals. Previously, Dan was the CEO and co-founder of EcoScraps, which was acquired by Scott's Miracle-Gro, where he was the director of their sustainability and hydroponic business unit. Additionally, he's led sustainability initiatives for the U.S. State Department, United Nations, World Food Program, Amazon, Google, Home Depot, Walmart, and some of the world's largest food companies. Dan has been named as one of the top social impact entrepreneurs in the U.S. By Bloomberg Businessweek, and has been featured as a cover story in both Inc. magazine and Forbes. And Dan studied English at BYU, where he currently serves as an adjunct professor and is on the board of advisors for the Ballard Center of Social Impact. And so with that, Dan, I'm going to turn it over to you. The floor is yours.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I'm just going to share my screen really quickly. All right, like David mentioned, we are going to be talking about donor advice funds, and so let's just jump right into it. Before we get into the specifics of donor advice funds, I do want to talk about why charitable giving strategies matter for wealth advisors. So I'm going to share 3 stats that come from a benchmarking study of 1,200 independent RIAs and family offices. And what they were looking at were those that included charitable planning in their service offering compared to those that did not. And what they found is those that did include charitable planning saw 6 times the median assets compared to those that don't. They had 3 times the amount of organic growth. And I think perhaps the most interesting and the most compelling was when the client was asked the question, do you view your financial advisor or your wealth manager as a multi-generational resource to your family? Those that included charitable planning scored 27% higher. And where I think that is just really fascinating is given the wealth transfer that's currently happening. And one of the most compelling things that you can do to continue to work with one generation and then the next is to include charitable planning. And this is in part because it helps align the financial plan with the larger, bigger picture plans that the family has and that the next generation has. And so, in setting the stage of why you should care about charitable strategies, I want to jump into donor advised funds, in part because I really believe they are the most flexible and the most compelling tool when it comes to charitable planning. And we'll get into a few of the reasons as to why. But first, just what is a donor advised fund? A donor advised fund is a giving account that's established for future charitable giving. It allows you to, if we go to this next slide, it allows you to separate the timing of your tax deduction from the timing of your charitable giving. So with a donor advised fund, you have a donor and they contribute into the DAF, which is housed at a public charity. And at the time of that contribution, you receive a tax deduction. And then those assets sit in the donor advised fund. They can be invested, they grow tax-free. And when the donor wants to, they can then issue grants to nonprofits or other social ventures. And so this concept is a pretty easy concept of teasing out the timing of the tax deduction from the timing of your charitable giving. But it's an incredibly powerful concept. And we have a couple of examples that will illustrate why. But the reason it's so powerful is it allows you to optimize for both of those decisions. In most cases, these decisions get mashed together, and you're making a gift to a charity at the same time that you're qualifying for a tax deduction. And because when that happens, you're really not able to optimize for either one. And so when you are looking at a donor advised fund, whether it's at UI Charitable or any other DAF host, there are three things that you should always consider. One is the type of asset that you can contribute into the donor advised fund. The second is how those assets are then managed. And then the third is what giving opportunities are available. So if we look at this, kind of those three buckets align with what the donor can contribute, this first box, how those DAF assets are managed, and again, what you can do from a charitable standpoint. And so let's go a little bit deeper into each of those three categories. So most donor advised funds allow for traditional assets, cash and public securities. A lot of higher net worth individuals have non-traditional assets. They might be an entrepreneur with private business interests, or they might be an investor invested in a venture capital fund or a private equity fund. Generally, higher net worth individuals have some real estate. More and more, we are seeing, especially with younger generations, more exposure to cryptocurrency. Also see people with fine arts and collectibles and just all other types of assets. And some of these non-traditional assets will also be the most highly appreciated assets in the donor's portfolio. And so when you're considering any donor advised fund, you want to look at what assets will they accept, and how streamlined or how complicated is the process of contributing that asset to the donor advised fund. At UI Charitable, we have really specialized in the non-traditional assets. Of course, we can accept cash and public securities, but we think there's a tremendous amount of value in being able to accept any highly appreciated asset that a donor may want to give for charitable purposes. This second bucket, flexible account management. So like I mentioned, when those assets move into the DAF, they can then be invested while they wait to be deployed for charitable purposes. And so our approach is to, we've created a totally open architecture, which allows the donor to assign their financial advisor to manage the donor advised fund, regardless of the account size. Many DAF providers do allow financial advisors to be assigned to the account, but they typically have minimums. And those minimums can be as high as $150,000 before you can assign your financial advisor to advise on that account. We think it's really important that the DAF account gets treated the exact same way as any other account that the donor has. And so we've removed all of those minimums. So whoever the financial advisor is, they're managing all the other accounts in the client's portfolio. We think it's really important that they're able to manage the DAF account as well. We would then work with the financial advisor to select their preferred custodian. And so if you want all of the assets in the DAF account to be at Schwab, we allow you to work with Schwab or Fidelity or Pershing or whoever it may be. Then you as the financial advisor, you are able to choose how those assets are invested. You're able to bill against that account just like you would any other account. And we also allow for our donors and our financial advisors, in the case that they want to make alternative investments out of their DAF. And so just understanding the flexibility that you have in managing the DAF account is also a really important consideration. This third area, understanding what giving options are available. Just about all donor advised funds are going to allow you to give grants to domestic charities. At community foundations, they're going to recommend that those grants are directed to that specific community. That's really the mandate of a community foundation. With larger donor advised funds like Fidelity Charitable or Schwab Charitable or Vanguard Charitable, they're not going to have any preference towards any particular community, but generally they are going to limit your grant making to domestic charities. It's important to recognize that the IRS allows for a lot more than just domestic grant making. They allow for you to issue loans to charities. You can make equity investments in social ventures. They allow for both domestic and international giving, as well as grant making and impact investing. And so again, as you consider a donor advised fund for any of your clients, you'll want to pay attention to what assets you can contribute, how those assets are managed, and the flexibility that you will have as the financial advisor in managing those assets. And then the whole reason that DAFs exist is so that the donor can engage in charitable giving. And so making sure that they have all the flexibility that's allowed by the IRS to accomplish their charitable missions. So I think one of the best ways to understand a donor advised fund and to really understand the benefits of a donor advised fund is in comparing it to a private foundation. Most people are familiar with private foundations. Currently, about half of high net worth individuals still aren't familiar with donor advised funds. And so this just becomes a really easy point of comparison. So a couple of areas. So the first one is looking at the fees and setup. Because a donor advised fund is a part of an existing public charity, setting up a new DAF, a specific donor advised fund account, can happen almost immediately. All donor advised funds are going to charge a DAF admin fee. Those are generally pretty low. Our DAF admin fee, Fidelity Charitable, Schwab Charitable, starts at 0.6%, and they all go down to about 0.1%. So it really is really reasonable from an administrative standpoint. And there are essentially no startup costs in setting up a donor advised fund. Whereas a private foundation is its own independent entity. And that entity generally requires an attorney or an accounting team to help set up and to make sure that it's compliant with the IRS. And that filing with the state happens pretty quickly, but the filing with the IRS can take several months to get approval and to get your tax exemption for that foundation. So now looking at the causes to support, the reason why you'd have either a donor advised fund or a private foundation, again, is because you want to engage in charitable giving. Both DAFs and private foundations can give domestically and internationally. They can both engage in grant making and impact investing. And the biggest point of difference, and this is a really important call out, is a donor advised fund can only give to other entities, so that you can't give directly to an individual. Whereas with a private foundation, you can give grants to individuals. And from a practical standpoint, where this plays out is with scholarships. You can manage a scholarship fund directly out of a private foundation, and you couldn't do that through a donor advised fund. What you can do through a donor advised fund is you can financially support a separate scholarship fund. And it just so happens that most scholarship funds are housed at universities and other educational institutions. And so, you know, there's still a way that you can engage in issuing scholarships, but you'd have to find a third-party partner if you're working out of a donor advised fund. Otherwise, everything that you can do in a private foundation, you could do through a donor advised fund. So now the tax benefits, and I think this is the most interesting one. Cash donations, a donor advised fund, you have a 60% adjusted gross income tax deductibility limit, 60% AGI limit, whereas in a private foundation, it's a 30% AGI limit. And so the DAF is, you know, twice as much. Short-term capital gains, 50% AGI in the DAF, 30% in the private foundation. Long-term, 30% AGI limit, 20% in the private foundation. In both a DAF and a private foundation, if you exceed the AGI limit, you can roll that forward up to 5 years. But the real kicker is the fair market value. So all securities are deducted at a fair market value in a donor advised fund, But in a private foundation, only publicly traded stocks are deducted at the fair market value. All non-public securities, so all of those non-traditional assets that high net worth individuals have, those are all deducted at the cost basis. So you get zero benefit for the appreciation. And it's for that reason that one of the biggest trends that we see in philanthropy right now is people setting up DAFs in place of private foundations and even closing their private foundations and moving all of the assets into a donor advised fund. And so these tax benefits, I mean, this is why donor advised funds are so compelling, especially if you go back to this idea that a donor advised fund is separating out the timing of your tax deduction from the timing of your charitable giving so that you can optimize for both of those. So if you're really optimizing for the tax deduction, you're going to opt for a donor advised fund compared to a private foundation. So 3 more other areas that I think are really important to consider. Both a DAF and a private foundation can set up succession plans. It is generally just much easier to do in a donor advised fund, again, because it's not its own entity. Because a private foundation is its own entity, you can only set up successors through a vote of the board of trustees for that private foundation. Annual distributions. There are no required distributions from a charitable standpoint coming out of a donor advised fund. Private foundations have a 5% annual distribution, a minimum of 5%. And if you're looking to be anonymous, a lot of higher net worth individuals, they want to be anonymous in their giving. They don't want everyone to know what they're engaging with. They are oftentimes engaging in charity because they care about that social problem, not because they want a lot of public recognition. That's not always the case, but oftentimes it is. You can only be anonymous through a donor advised fund. All contributions are made public in a private foundation. And just depending on the motivations and what the individual is trying to accomplish, that may or may not be a really big deal. But as I went through this comparison of looking at a private foundation and a DAF, you can essentially accomplish everything and more through a DAF as you could through a private foundation, but it comes with the benefit of having essentially twice the tax efficiency in the DAF versus the private foundation. So now I want to get into 2 specific case studies, and hopefully these case studies are super practical, but also illustrate the power of separating out the timing of the tax deduction from the timing of your charitable giving. And so this first strategy, we call it charitable bunching. And so what this is it's creating an arbitrage in the standard deduction and the itemized deduction. And so you front load multiple years worth of charitable giving into a single year to maximize that itemized deduction. And then in all of the subsequent years, you're just going to claim the standard deduction. And so really what we're doing with charitable bunching is we're just playing with the timing of your giving. And so let's get into the specifics of this. So let's assume you are working with a married couple and you go through their charitable giving history, and on average, they're giving, say, $15,000 a year to several different charities. This might be their church, this might be the university that they attended, this might be the local Boys and Girls Club. I mean, there are all sorts of different charities that they might support. And this is what most people do. They give, on average, whatever the amount is, in this example, $15,000 a year to different charities, and they do it year after year. Once they start supporting a charity, they oftentimes continue to support that charity. And so if we look at their tax situation, they're donating $15,000 a year to charities. They're going to have some additional deductions, state and local taxes, mortgage interest. And so in this scenario, we're going to say that their total yearly itemized deductions, $31,000, slightly above the standard deduction. And so the total donations over a 5-year period is $75,000. This $15,000 a year times 5. The total tax deduction is going to be, the same 5-year period, 5 times the total yearly itemized deduction, 31,000. So they're donating $75,000 over that 5-year period, and they're claiming a tax deduction of $155,000. Now let's take the same scenario, but just change the timing of their giving. And so it's the same married couple. They're still giving $15,000 a year to several different charities. But what we're going to do is we're going to take that and we're going to put all of it into a single year. And so instead of donating to those individual charities, they're going to move this $15,000 a year over 5 years, so $75,000 total, into a donor advised fund. They still have the state and local taxes. They still have the mortgage interest. So now in year 1, the total itemized deductions, $91,000, $63,000 above the standard deduction. So now in years 2 through 5, they're not doing any additional charitable giving. What they're doing is they're just taking the funds from the DAF that have been set aside and they're giving out of there. So they're still supporting whatever charities it is that they care about. They're still supporting their local church, the university, the local Boys and Girls Club. But from a tax standpoint, what they're now going to do is just claim the standard deduction for years 2 through 5. So if we take that almost $28,000 for that 4-year period, it totals just over $110,000. And so the total donations in both scenarios, without charitable bunching and charitable bunching, is $75,000. We haven't changed the amount that they're giving at all. All we have done is change the timing of their giving. But the total tax deduction over the 5-year period is now increased to just over $200,000. And so without charitable bunching, if we're not optimizing for the tax deduction, the additional tax savings above the standard deduction over that 5-year period is $16,000. Whereas with charitable bunching, it's just over $60,000. It's 3 times the tax savings over that 5-year period by simply changing the timing and optimizing for that tax deduction. And so when I talk about, a DAF really is just a simple tool allowing you to separate out the timing of the tax deduction from the timing of your charitable giving. This example of charitable bunching, I think, really illustrates that. So if we get into this next case study, the gifting of a private business, and this is true of any highly appreciated asset. So this might be a private business, this could be real estate, this could be cryptocurrency. And again, if we look at how do we optimize for the tax deduction, in the second example, we're going to show how you can both get a personal tax deduction in addition to avoiding capital gains. And so you're essentially double dipping from a tax benefit standpoint. And so why donate a business or any highly appreciated asset prior to sale? It's so that you can avoid capital gains on the portion that's donated, and you can claim a personal tax deduction. So let's assume you're now working with a family of entrepreneurs. They started a business and they want to be charitably active in retirement. Given their full financial situation, you suggest that they donate $2 million to charity. We're going to assume that their taxes include 20% capital gains and 7% state tax. So 27% total. So let's look at what most people do. And this is, like David mentioned at the very beginning, I started a company, EcoScraps, and sold it to Scott's Miracle-Gro. And so this is really what I did. Most people do this first scenario. It is not a tax efficient scenario, but unfortunately, this is what most entrepreneurs are doing. They donate cash after the sale. So let's look at the details of this. So this family, they're selling their business for $10 million. They're not donating it before the sale. And it has a super low cost basis. We're assuming that they started the business, they were entrepreneurs. So the total taxable amount is $9.9 million. You sell the business, you get hit with a pretty big tax bill, $2.6 million here. Your after-tax equity is $7.3 million. And at this point, what I did and what most entrepreneurs do, unfortunately, is they donate their post-tax dollars to charity. So they make a $2 million donation to the charity of their choice. So their final equity is $5.3 million. They do qualify for the gift tax deduction, that $2 million tax deductible. And if we assume that they're in one of the highest tax brackets, 44%, that tax deduction would be worth about $880,000. So in this first scenario, again, which is what I did and what most entrepreneurs do, the final equity plus the tax savings would be $6.2 million, just over $6.2 million. So now let's look at if we just change the timing of their giving. We're not changing the amount, we're just going to change the timing of their giving. They still sell the business for $10 million, but now instead of donating cash, they move $2 million of equity, so 20% of the business, they donate to their donor advised fund. And so they're taking this illiquid asset of equity and putting it into the donor advised fund. So now the business has two owners. It has the individual and it has their donor advised fund. The cost basis is still $100,000, but the taxable amount has now decreased by $2 million. Because a donor advised fund is a public charity, it is not subject to capital gains. And so only the portion that's owned by the individual now has to pay capital gains. So this taxable amount has decreased from 9.9 to $7.9 million. The taxes are now $500,000 less. Instead of $2.6 million in capital gains taxes, you're paying $2.1 million. So the after-tax equity is significantly lower because they've already made that donation. They moved $2 million of equity, 20% of ownership of the business, they moved into the donor advised fund. But because of that, they're not making any donation after the sale of the business. But when the business sells, the individual receives their cash, and the donor advised fund also converts that equity into cash. So at the sale of the business, the equity in the donor advised fund turns to cash. So the end result for the donor advised fund is the same. The end result is $2 million in cash, even though the gift was in equity and not in cash. And so now the final equity, instead of being $5.3 million, is $5.8 million. And you still qualify for that same gift tax deduction valued at $880,000. So the final equity and the tax savings where you donate prior to the sale versus after the sale has now increased to 6.7, just over 6.7 million. And so if we look at this, the reason why timing matters is if you can move the ownership from your personal ownership into the donor advised fund, you eliminate capital gains on the portion that's in the donor advised fund. And you qualify for that personal tax deduction. And so if we look at this on a $10 million transaction, a $2 million donation, you are saving your client $540,000 net after taxes. There are very, very few things that you could do as a financial advisor or a wealth manager to save your client that much in taxes off of a single transaction. And again, just what is so unfortunate is most people aren't thinking about their charitable giving from the standpoint of how can I optimize for the tax deduction and how can I optimize for the charities that I want to give to. And so, the benefit of all of this isn't just what you are saving them, but what you're also doing is you are buying them time so that they can be really thoughtful and deliberate about what charities that they want to give to. When I sold my business, I felt like I was in a rush having to make all these decisions. How much am I setting aside for charity? What are those charities going to be? But the benefit of a donor advised fund is you can just deal with the tax deduction when you need to deal with the tax deduction. And then when you have time, when you've put the thought into it, you can then deal with the charitable giving. And so in addition to the personal tax deduction, in addition to avoiding the capital gains, um, if those assets are invested after the sale of the business, those assets would grow tax-free in the donor advised fund. And so now the family has that $2 million that they can give to the social causes, the nonprofits, the social ventures that they're most passionate about. So hopefully those two examples really help illustrate just what a donor advised fund is and the power of a donor advised fund, and really the power of separating out the timing of the tax deduction and what it really means to optimize for the tax deduction. And oftentimes it's just changing the timing of their giving. And separating all of that from the timing of somebody's charitable giving. So given the benefits of incorporating charitable strategies into your service offering, given all the benefits and the versatility of a donor advised fund, now I want to take just a couple of minutes and talk about where a donor advised fund fits in the discussions with clients. So annual portfolio reviews, when you're looking at the portfolio, when you are looking at how what assets have appreciated and how much they have appreciated, that helps identify, again, from a tax deduction standpoint, when they should be moving assets into a donor advised fund. When they're in a really high income year and they're going to be in a higher tax bracket, those are the years that you're going to want to overemphasize their charitable giving to help lower that tax burden. When you have a business sale or some large liquidity event of a highly appreciated asset, when you are going through tax and estate planning discussions, and generally just when you are looking at capital gains management, at all these times you will want to talk about donor advised funds and help show how a donor advised fund really is a very flexible tool in optimizing for the tax deduction. It's also really important not to lose sight that a donor advised fund only makes sense in the case that your client is charitably inclined. And in the case that they are charitably inclined, most individuals don't want to talk about the tax deduction. That's not why they're giving. They're giving because there's some charity, there's some social cause that they care deeply about and that they want to support. And so one of the mistakes that I see is the advisor overemphasizes the tax deduction piece of it. You need to understand those details and you need to help them navigate the timing of all of that so that they can optimize for their taxes. But what they really want to talk about is the reason why they're doing all of this, why they care so deeply about any given charity or nonprofit. And so, these are pretty simple questions, but this helps surface that charitable intent and really helps you understand what they value from a charitable giving standpoint. Do your clients have charitable intent or are they already active donors? Just understanding what their charitable giving history is. And this one, while it seems like a really simple question, a lot of people are very charitably active without recognizing it. They might be giving to their church, they might be giving to their university, and not really thinking about it as charitable giving. Supporting local sports teams, the local Boys and Girls Club. And so, really, really digging into all of the different types of organizations that they are giving to. Do your clients have a need for a tax deduction this year, but want to decide which charities they want to support over time? And it's the second part of this question that's really important. A lot of people are charitably inclined. They want to support different charities, especially with a lot of higher net worth individuals. The times and priorities of the stages of their life changes. And so they will go from being really focused on business or their professional activity. And during that time, they don't have the time to think about what charities they specifically want to support. And they recognize that there's going to be a different stage of their life where they do have more time, and that's how they want to be engaging with their time. And so understanding that they should separate out the timing of the tax deduction from the timing of their charitable giving. Many high net worth individuals, like I've talked about, are really familiar with private foundations, and they just assume that's the best solution for them because it's really the only thing that they're familiar with. Half of high net worth individuals still aren't familiar with donor advised funds. And so oftentimes we will see people start exploring private foundations and they get turned off by the complexity, the burden, and the overall just expense of ongoing administration. They don't want to deal with that complexity. What they want is the flexibility of the charitable giving. And so, just asking them, have you ever considered a private foundation? If so, why? What did you like about it? What didn't you like about private foundation? And using that as a way of introducing donor advised funds. This question number 4 gets into the capital gains management. When someone is giving, most people give cash. That's the least tax efficient thing that you should give. And so before your client ever writes another check to charity, you should help them understand their overall portfolio and identify everything that has a low cost basis and that's been highly appreciated. And that's what they should be giving, not cash. Very similar. Do your clients, question number 5, do your clients plan to sell a private business interest or an entire company? Where this one is interesting is most entrepreneurs don't sell many businesses. You will spend your entire career building the business, and this is kind of a once in a lifetime transaction. And again, I'll use myself as an example. I built this company, EcoScraps, sold it to Scott's Miracle Grow. That transaction was the single most important business transaction that had happened, up until that point for me. And I totally blew it from a tax planning standpoint. And there are kind of no redos. And so talking to your clients early about this, even before they're getting into the specifics of selling their business, so that they understand these dynamics, they understand the importance of getting the timing right, so that when a sale comes up, they understand the individual steps that they need to take, and they don't feel like this is complicating the sale of the business at all. So that's really everything that I wanted to go through, and I just wanted to make sure that we had a few minutes to go through any questions that any of you had.
Thank you so much, Dan. Super interesting. I think some of the initial facts about DAFs are review for our members, but probably nice review if they're not using them on a regular basis. And then some of those strategies to watch out for. I don't see any Q&A right now. If anyone has any questions, please drop them in that Q&A section. I just wanted to highlight something that you said about the way that you approach this conversation. I think that as advisors, we're always looking to, I think, maybe justify our fees with financial savings. And so that the tax impact is making a side-by-side comparison of tax impact for us feels like, this covers my fees for the next 5 years. It's a really great opportunity. But is that really what motivates your client, especially with this opportunity when what we're really talking about is giving back? I think in the vein of sort of George Kinder, what lights the torch for folks? And for some folks, it might be tax savings. Some people really dislike paying taxes, or at least at, some sort of hierarchy of needs that does come up. But yeah, can you engage a client or prospective client in talking about what really just fires them up? And oftentimes it's giving back to someone who gave them an opportunity or a cause that did that, and just feeding that forward. So that was a great thing to highlight, I think.
Jumping into that, just a quick story. Given my background, I interact with a lot of entrepreneurs. That's kind of the core of my network. And I recently had a conversation with an entrepreneur who had gone through a very, very sizable sale of their business. And when that happened, Goldman Sachs, all of these kind of big brand financial advisors started reaching out and they started pitching him on, all of these very sophisticated strategies. And he ended up going with a pretty small financial advisor. And I was candidly surprised by that. So I asked, why did you decide to go with this smaller, no name brand shop and not any of these larger shops that, probably just they do have more resources? And he said, I didn't want to hear any more about tax savings, about these strategies. He said, I just assume that you know that. Like to be a financial advisor, you need to understand that. What I wanted to talk about and what no one would engage with me on was what I now want, like what I want my legacy to be about. And I want to talk to somebody about legacy making. I want to talk to someone about the values that I have and what this means for my family. And I just assume that you will take care of all of the complicated tax stuff on the back end, but that's not what I want to engage on. But that's what Goldman Sachs and everyone else led with. But it was this much smaller shop that led from a values standpoint.
Yeah, I love that story. The power of coming from a planning perspective and also just a personable, yeah, what are you really trying to accomplish? Especially at a liquidity event, I would think that, at least maybe for a short period of time, maybe like a honeymoon phase, you kind of feel like, hey, my
Mhm.
money problems are solved now in a way. And of course you want to optimize and be smart, but yeah, you're starting to think about what's the life that I want to build with this?
Mhm.
And if you can get to that place of giving, can be very powerful for activating the relationship. So very cool. A few questions. Dan, are you comfortable with us distributing the slides from this presentation?
Of course. Yep.
Excellent. Cool. We will do that. We are going to send the recording as well. That should be coming in the next couple of days. A question from Sarah. How complicated is donating a business before a sale? Does it complicate the sale? And I wonder if maybe the corporate structure, if it's a C Corp, S Corp, whatever, if that has implications, Delaware. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So when you are donating a business prior to the sale, again, you're donating equity. You're not donating cash. And so that process is a little bit different. It's managed through a gift agreement that so we manage all of this in-house. So we would look at the governance docs of the business. And so the governance docs are going to be different for every C corporation, S corporation, LLC, and they're going to have different requirements. And the gift agreement needs to meet the requirements in the governance docs of that particular business. And so we do the due diligence, we review the governance docs, we put together the gift agreement and make sure that it's in compliance with the governance docs. And then when that gift agreement is executed, that ownership, that's what moves the ownership from the individual or however they own it, whether they own it personally through an LLC, through a trust, into their donor advised fund. And so it's a process that you need to get right, but it's a very streamlined process, and we deal with all of the complexity there. And it absolutely does not need to complicate the sale of the business. Generally, it's no more complicated than talking to the buyer and saying, I'm moving some of my ownership into a donor advised fund for tax planning purposes. And that's kind of the extent of the conversation. And they say, yep, that makes sense. We have no issues. We have gone through hundreds of these and are yet to see an issue with that.
Okay, that's really helpful. Are there, just a quick follow-up, are there specific clauses that advisors should be looking for if they're doing sort of a first blush assessment of those documents?
So not in the governance docs, but what they are going to want to pay attention to is to avoid capital gains, the donation needs to be made before any definitive sales agreement has been signed.
Okay.
And so you want to avoid binding letters of intent. You want to avoid definitive sales agreements. So, if I was a financial advisor, that's what I would be keeping my eye on is we need to do this before any of that happens. And so making sure that you're reviewing the LOI, making sure that you're reviewing the sales documents to make sure that this donation is done prior to those being executed.
Okay, cool. And I would think that qualified small business stock as well, that kind of like disqualifies it from the opportunity in terms of avoiding capital gains that you will be already, assuming that you qualify.
Mhm.
Okay, cool. That's really helpful. Um, Another question from Bruce says, great program for the super charitable. Any dollars saved on tax increases future philanthropic capacity. So great point. Balancing that between the financial benefit and the impact benefit. They're intertwined and related. Good call.
Mhm. Yep, absolutely. And I mean, just the other point there, and we touched on it a couple of times, but we really just kind of glossed over it. But the fact that the assets in the DAF grow tax free. So, for the super charitable, if you are, doing charitable bunching, or if you've sold a business and you've put a large amount in the DAF, you're probably not giving all of it away in 1 year. So you probably are putting together a strategy with the financial advisor in saying how, I just put $75,000 into this DAF. Can we grow it to be $90,000 so that it's not 5 years worth of giving? It's now 6 years worth of giving. And so there's also a lot of power in being able to grow those assets without the headwinds of taxes on those particular assets.
That's a great point. That's a great point. I think you answered this one also from Bruce in terms of like contemplation of sale type restrictions on gifts of private stock. So I think you said binding LOIs, things like that.
Mhm.
That would be considered essentially constructive receipt.
Yep.
Okay, okay. That's helpful. Hopefully that answers that question, Bruce. Um, Another question from Sarah. What happens to the donor advised fund after the client passes away?
So again, if we go back to this slide on the DAF versus the private foundation, you can set up a succession plan. And so typically what, kind of the most common things that we see is individuals will say, at my passing, I want all of the funds to go to this particular charity or this, particular group of charities. Or they'll say, I want to assign my spouse or my child or this other trusted individual to manage the remaining assets as they see fit. And so, with that second option, you can really set it up to be a perpetual giving fund, helping to establish your legacy, where it can go from one generation to the next, just like many large private foundations.
Okay. Just out of curiosity, what is the name of that role, the person who's managing the DAF? What would you call that if you're going to designate someone to be that person?
The technical term is donor advisor.
Okay. Okay, cool. And no investment advisory background, anything like that needed to manage those assets.
No, so I mean, there's kind of two advisory roles. There's the donor advisor, and they have the power to pick any financial advisor. So that's kind of one bucket of responsibilities is making sure that the assets are being managed properly while they're waiting to be deployed for charitable purposes. So the donor advisor selects the financial advisor. The donor advisor is also the one that's recommending all of the charitable grants. It's then the financial advisor, once you're assigned to a donor advised fund, you take on all of the investment responsibilities. So there's, kind of those two roles that need to be coordinated, but they do have different responsibilities.
Okay, that's helpful. I know that you're being respectful of not just trying to, represent UI Charitable and educate the membership here in the audience, but I think implementation is important, and I think folks have questions about what are the different options for setting up DAFs, restrictions on
Mhm.
different platforms, how do they get access to this, how do I go about implementing?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we go back to those three buckets that I talked about that you should look at when you set up a donor advised fund, what type of asset can you donate? How are those assets managed? How are those assets deployed for charitable purposes? Our goal at UI Charitable is to give the donor and their financial advisor as much flexibility as possible. So that means on what type of asset can you contribute to the DAF? Any type of asset that you want, any asset that makes sense from a tax standpoint, we have a very streamlined process to accept that. On the DAF management side, we've removed all of the minimums. So regardless of the size of the account, the donor can assign you to be the financial advisor. We would then work with you to set up to have those assets be at your preferred custodian. So if you want the assets at Schwab, let's have them at Schwab. If you want them at Fidelity, let's have them at Fidelity. And what that allows you to do is the DAF account now looks like every other account that you're managing. So it fits seamlessly into your full process. You bill against it the exact same way you bill against any other account. You invest those funds the exact same way that you invest any other account that you're managing. So that open architecture allowing it really allows it to fit into your process regardless of what that process is as a financial advisor. And then the third area is we've removed all of the restrictions around the charitable giving side. So anything that the IRS allows for, we allow for the donor to give to. So if that's domestic, if that's international, if that's a grant, if that's an impact investment, we are fantastic with all of it. And our team will help in the sourcing of opportunities, the due diligence of those charitable activities. So it really feels like you have a fully staffed family foundation where the family's setting the strategy, but our team is executing on all of it. And the great thing about UI Charitable is we offer all of that flexibility for the exact same price as Fidelity Charitable or Schwab Charitable. And so it's way more flexibility at the exact same price from a DAF admin fee.
Very cool. You made a helpful clarification for me prior to us launching the webinar that Schwab Charitable is very different than Schwab the custodian. And so what is allowable on the custodian, side may not necessarily if managed by a third party like UI that has less restrictions in terms of assets in the DAF and also distributions and grants, who those go to.
Mm-hmm.
Those can live on Schwab, whereas some of the restrictions with UI Charitable, or sorry, not with UI, with Schwab Charitable, are not necessarily carried over just to the custodian itself.
Exactly. Yep.
Oh, cool. Well, I don't have any more questions here. We've got just 3 minutes left. I did drop in an email address if you want to reach out to UI Charitable to learn more. If you have questions, I'm sure that Dan and team would be happy to be consultative, whether or not you engage with them. So there's an email address to reach out there. If you're interested in XYPN Network membership, if you're not already a member, I've also dropped in a link to schedule a call. And the last piece here is just that we will have a feedback survey pop up after the webinar. If you don't mind giving us a rating, suggesting a topic, giving us your feedback, we would really appreciate it. But thank you so much, Dan. This has been awesome. Really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, take care, everyone. Bye-bye.